Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It's time for our next story, which is The Shadow over Innsmouth. This one's about 70 pages. I'm going to read like 40 of them today, and then I'll finish the rest tomorrow. But we'll see how this one goes. Hopefully, it's a bit more to the point than the last one. Like, At the Mountains of Madness wasn't bad, but it felt kind of like it dragged. I know, oh yeah, there was so much like hyper description in things. But yeah, we'll see. I think I've heard that this one is quite good from friends of mine that are familiar with Lovecraft's works. The Shadow over Innsmouth. During the winter of 1927 to 28, officials of the federal government made a strange and secret investigation of certain conditions in the ancient Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. The public first learned of it in February when a vast series of raids and arrests occurred, followed by the deliberate burning and dynamiting, under suitable precautions, of an enormous number of crumbling, worm-eaten, and supposedly empty houses along the abandoned waterfront. Uninquiring souls let this occurrence pass as one of the major clashes in a spasmodic war on liquor. Keener news followers, however, wondered at the prodigious number of arrests, the abnormally large force of men used in making them, and the secrecy surrounding the disposal of the prisoners. No trials or even definite charges were reported, nor were any of the captives seen thereafter in the regular jails of the nation. There were vague statements about disease in concentration camps, and later about dispersal in various naval and military prisons, but nothing positive ever developed. Innsmouth itself was left almost depopulated, and is even now only beginning to show signs of a sluggishly revived existence. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. Newspaper men were harder to manage, but seemed largely to cooperate with the government in the end. Only one paper, a tabloid always discounted because of its wild policy, mentioned the deep-diving submarine that discharged torpedoes downward into the marine abyss just beyond Devil Reef. That item, gathered by chance in this haunt of sailors, seemed indeed rather far-fetched, since the low Black Reef lies a full mile and a half out from Innsmouth Harbor. People around the country and in nearby towns muttered a great deal amongst themselves, but said very little to the outer world. They had talked about dying and half-deserted Innsmouth for nearly a century, and nothing new could be wilder or more hideous than what they had whispered and hinted years before. Many things had taught them secretiveness, and there was no need to exert pressure on them. Besides, they really knew little, for wide salt marshes, desolate and unpeopled, kept neighbors off from Innsmouth on the landward side. But at last I'm going to defy the ban on speech about this thing. Results, I am certain, are so thorough that no public harm, save a shock of repulsion, could ever accrue from hinting of what was found by those horrified raiders at Innsmouth. Besides, what was found might possibly have more than one explanation. I do not know just how much of the whole tale has been told even to me, and I have many reasons for not wishing to probe deeper. For my contact with this affair has been closer than that of any other layman, and I have carried away impressions which are yet to drive me to drastic measures. It is I who fled frantically out of Innsmouth in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1927, and whose frightened appeals for government inquiry and action brought on the whole reported episode. I was willing enough to stay mute while the affair was fresh and uncertain, but now that it is an old story, with public interest and curiosity gone, I have an odd craving to whisper about those few frightful hours in the ill-rumored and evilly shadowed seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. The mere telling helps me to restore confidence in my own faculties, to reassure myself that I was not simply the first to succumb to a contagious nightmare hallucination. It helps me, too, in making up my mind regarding a certain terrible step which lies ahead of me. I never heard of Innsmouth till the day before I saw it for the first, and, so far, last time. I was celebrating my coming of age by a tour of New England, sightseeing, antiquary, and genealogical, and had planned to go directly from ancient Newburyport to Arkham, whence my mother's family was derived. I had no car, but was traveling by train, trolley, and motor coach, always seeking the cheapest possible route. In Newburyport, they told me that the steam train was the thing to take to Arkham, and it was only at the station ticket office, when I demurred at the high fare, that I learned about Innsmouth. The stout, shrewd-faced agent, whose speech showed him to be no local man, seemed sympathetic towards my efforts at economy, and made a suggestion that none of my other informants had offered. You could take that old bus, I suppose, he said with a certain hesitation, but it ain't thought much of hereabouts. It goes through Innsmouth, you may have heard of that, and so the people don't like it. Run by an Innsmouth fellow, Joe Sargent, but never gets any customs from here or Arkham either, I guess. Wonder it keeps running at all. Suppose it's cheap enough. Never seen more'n 2 or 3 people in it. Nobody but those Innsmouth folks. Leaves the square, front of Hammond's drugstore, 10 a.m., 7 p.m., unless they changed lately. Looks like a terrible rattletrap. Never been on it. That was the first I had ever heard of shadowed Innsmouth. Any reference to a town not shown on common maps or listed in recent guidebooks would have interested me, and the agent's odd manner of allusion roused something like real curiosity. A town able to inspire such dislike in its neighbors, I thought must be at least rather unusual and worthy of a tourist's attention. If it came before Arkham, I would stop off there, and so I asked the agent to tell me something about it. He was very deliberate and spoke with an air of feeling slightly superior to what he said. Innsmouth? Well, it's a queer kind of town down at the mouth of the Montserrat. Used to be almost a city, quite a port before the War of 1812, but all gone to pieces in the last 100 years or so. No railroad now, B&M never went through, and the branch line from Raleigh was given up years ago. More empty houses than there are people, I guess, and no business to speak of except fishing and lobstering. Everybody trades mostly either here in Arkham or Ipswich. Once they had quite few mills, but nothing's left now except one gold refinery running on the leanest kind of part-time. That refinery, though, used to be a big thing, and the old man Marsh, who owns it, must be richer than Croesus. Croesus. Queer old duck, though, and sticks mighty close to his home. He's supposed to have developed some skin disease or deformity in late life that makes him keep out of sight. Grandson of the Captain Obed Marsh, who founded the business. His mother seems to have been some kind of foreigner, they say a South Sea Islander, so I bet he raised Cain when he married an Ipswich girl 50 years ago. They always do that about Innsmouth people, and folks here and hereabouts always try to cover up any Innsmouth blood they have in them. But Marsh's children and grandchildren look just like anyone else as far as I can see. Had them pointed out to me here, though, come to think of it, the elder children don't seem to be around lately. Never saw the old man. And why is everybody so down on Innsmouth? Well, young fellow, you mustn't take too much stock in what people around here say. They're hard to get started, but once they do get started, they never let up. They've been telling things about Innsmouth, whispering them mostly, for the last 100 years, I guess. And I gather they're more scared than anything else. Some of the stories will make you laugh, about old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil and bringing imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth, or about some kind of devil worship and awful sacrifices in some places near the wharves that people stumbled on around 1845 or thereabouts. But I come from Panton, Vermont. That kind of story don't go down with me. You ought to hear it, though, what some of the old-timers tell about the Black Reef off the coast. The Devil Reef, they call it. It's well above the water a good part of the time, never much below it. But at that, you could hardly call it an island. Story is that there's a whole legion of devils seen sometimes on that reef, sprawled about or darting in and out of some of the caves near the top. It's a rugged, uneven thing, a good bit over a mile out, and toward the end of the shipping days, sailors used to take big detours just to avoid it. That is, sailors that didn't hail from Innsmouth. One of the things they had against old Captain Marsh is he was supposed to land on it sometimes at night when the tide was right. Maybe he did, for I dare say the rock formation was interesting, and it's just barely possible he was looking for pirate loot and maybe finding it. But there was talk of his dealing with demons there. Fact is, I guess the whole of it was the captain that gave the bad reputation to the reef. That was before the big epidemic of 1846, when over half the folks in Innsmouth was carried off. They never did quite figure out what the trouble was. It was probably some foreign kind of disease brought from China or somewhere by the shipping. Surely it was bad enough. There were riots over it and all sorts of ghastly doings that I don't believe ever got outside of town. Left the place in awful shape. Never came back. There can't be more than 300 or 400 people living there now. But the real thing behind the way folks feel is simply race prejudice, and I don't say I'm blaming those that hold it. I hate those Innsmouth folks myself, and I wouldn't care to go to their town. Suppose you know, though I can see you're a Westerner by your talk, there's a lot of New England ships that used to do queer ports in Africa, Asia, South Seas, and everywhere else, and what queer kinds of people they sometimes brought back with them. You probably heard about a Salem man come home with a Chinese wife, and maybe you know there's still a bunch of Fiji Islanders somewhere around Cape Cod. Well, there must be something like that back of the Innsmouth people. Place always badly cut off from the rest of the country by marshes and creeks. We can't be sure about the rest of the ins and outs of the matter, but it's pretty clear that old Captain Marsh must have brought home some odd specimens when he had all three of his ships commissioned back in the 20s and 30s. Certainly is a strange kind of streak in the Innsmouth folks lately. Don't know how to explain it, but it sort of makes your skin crawl. You'll notice a little in Sergeant if you take his bus. Some of them have queer narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy starry eyes that never seem to shut, and their skin ain't quite right. Rough and scabby, and the sides of their necks are all shriveled or creased up. Get bald, too, very young. The older fellows look the worst. Fact is, I don't believe I've ever seen a very old chap of that kind. Guess they must die of looking in the glass. Animals hate 'em. They used to have lots of horse trouble before the autos came in. Nobody around here, Arkham or Ipswich, will have anything to do with them. They act kind of offish themselves when they come to town, when anybody tries to fish on their grounds. Queer how fish are always thick off Innsmouth Harbor when there ain't anywhere else around. But just try to fish there yourself, you see how the folks chase you off. People used to come here on the railroad, walking and taking the train at Rowley after the branch was dropped, but now they use that bus. Yes, there's a hotel in Innsmouth called the Gilman House, but I don't believe it can amount to much. I wouldn't advise you to try it. Better stay over here and take the 10 o'clock bus tomorrow morning. Then you can get an evening bus there for Arkham at 8 o'clock. There's a factory inspector who stopped at the Gilman a couple of years ago, and he had a lot of unpleasant hints about the place. Seems they get a queer crowd there, for this fellow heard voices in other rooms. Though most of them was empty, they gave him the shivers. It was foreign talk, he thought. But he said the bad thing about it was the kind of voice that sometimes spoke. It sounded so unnatural, slopping like, he said, and he didn't dare undress and go to sleep. Just waited up and lit out first thing in the morning. Talk went on most all night. This fellow, Casey his name was, had a lot to say about the Innsmouth folks how the Innsmouth folks watched him, and seemed kind of on guard. He found the Marsh Refinery a queer place. It's an old mill on the lower falls of the Manishet. What he said tallied up with what I'd heard. Books in bad shape and no clear account of any kind of dealings. You know, it's always been kind of a mystery where the Marshes get the gold they refine. They never seemed to do much buying in that line, but years ago they shipped out an enormous lot of ingots. Used to be a talk of a queer foreign land kind of jewelry that the sailors and refinery men sometimes sold on the sly, or that was seen once or twice in some of Marsh's women folks. People allowed maybe old Captain Obed traded it for the heathen port, especially since he always ordered stacks of glass beads and trinkets such as seafaring men used to get for native trade. Others thought that, and still think I had found an old pirate cache out in Devil Reef. But here's the funny thing. The old captain's been dead for these 60 years, and there ain't been a good-sized ship out of the place since the Civil War. But just the same, the Marshes still keep on buying a few of those native trade things, mostly glass and rubber gewgaws, they tell me. Maybe the Innsmouth folks like 'em to look at themselves. God knows they've got to be about as bad as South Sea cannibals and the Guinea savages. That plague of 46 must have taken off the best blood in the place. Anyway, they're a doubtful lot now, and the Marshes and other rich folks are as bad as any. As I told you, there probably ain't more than 400 people in the whole town, in spite of all the streets they say they are. I guess they're doing what they call white trash down south, lawless and sly and full of secret doings. They get a lot of fish and lobsters and do exporting by truck. Queer how the fish swarm right there and nowhere else. Nobody can ever keep track of these people, and state school officials and census men have a devil of a time. You can bet that prying strangers ain't welcome around Innsmouth. I've heard personally of more than one business or government man that's disappeared there. There's loose talk of one who went crazy and is out at Danvers now. They must have fixed up some awful scare for that fellow. That's why I wouldn't go at night if I were you. I've never been there and have no wish to go, but I guess a daytime trip couldn't hurt, even though the people thereabouts will advise you not to make it. If you're just sightseeing, looking for an old time, Innsmouth ought to be quite a place for you. And so I spent a part of that evening at the Newburyport Public Library looking up data about Innsmouth. When I tried to question the natives in the shops, the lunchrooms, the garages, and the fire station, I had found them even harder to get started than the ticket agent had predicted. and realized that I could not spare the time to overcome their first instinctive reticences. Sorry. They had a kind of obscure suspiciousness, as if there were something amiss with anyone too much interested in Innsmouth. At the YMCA where I was stopping, the clerk merely discouraged my going to such a dismal, decadent place, and the people at the library showed much the same attitude. Clearly, in the eyes of the educated, Innsmouth was merely an exaggerated case of civic degeneration. The Essex County histories on the library shelves had very little to say, except that the town was founded in 1643, noted for shipbuilding before the Revolution, a seat of great marine prosperity in the early 19th century, and later a minor factory center using the Manichet as power. The epidemic and riots of 1846 were very sparsely treated, as if they formed a discredit to the country. References to decline were few, although the significance of the later record was unmistakable. After the Civil War, all industrial life was confined to the Marsh Refining Company, and the marketing of gold ingots formed the only remaining bit of major commerce aside from the eternal fishing. That fishing paid less and less as the price of the commodity fell, and large-scale corporations offered competition, but there was never a dearth of fish around Innsmouth Harbor. Foreigners seldom settled there, and there was some discreetly veiled evidence of a number of Poles and Portuguese who had tried it and had been scattered in a peculiarly drastic fashion. Most interesting of all was a glancing reference to the strange jewelry vaguely associated with Innsmouth. It had evidently impressed the whole countryside more than a little, for mention was made of specimens in the museums of the Miskatonic University at Arkham and in display room of the Newburyport Historical Society. The fragmentary descriptions of these things were bald and prosaic, but they hinted to me an undercurrent of persistent strangeness. Something about them seemed so odd and provocative that I could not put them out of my mind. Despite the relative lateness of the hour, I resolved to see the local sample, said to be a large, queerly proportioned thing evidently meant for a tiara, if it could possibly be arranged. The librarian gave me a note of introduction to the curator of the society, Miss Anna Tilton, who lived nearby, and after a brief explanation, that ancient gentlewoman was kind enough to pilot me into the closed building, since the hour was not outrageously late. The collection was a notable one indeed, but in my present mood I had eyes for nothing but the bizarre object which glistened in a corner cupboard under the electric lights. It took no excessive sensitiveness to beauty to make me literally gasp at the strange, unearthly splendor of the alien, opulent fantasy that rested there on the purple velvet cushion. Even now I can hardly describe what I saw, though it was clearly enough a sort of tiara, as the description had said. It was tall in front, with a very large and curiously irregular periphery, as if designed for a head of almost freakishly elliptical outline. The material seemed to be predominantly gold, though a weird, lighter lustrousness hinted at some strange alloy with an equally beautiful and scarcely identifiable metal. Its condition was almost perfect, and one could have spent hours in studying the striking and puzzlingly untraditional designs, some simply geometrical and some plainly marine, chased or molded in high relief on its surface with a craftsmanship of incredible skill and grace. The longer I looked, the more the thing fascinated me, and in this fascination there was a curiously disturbing element hardly to be classified or accounted for. At first I decided it was the queer otherworldly quality of the art which made me uneasy. All other art objects I had ever seen either belonged to some known racial or national stream, or else were consciously modernistic defiances of every recognized stream. This tiara was neither. It clearly belonged to some settled technique of infinite maturity and perfection, yet that technique was utterly remote from any Eastern, Western, ancient, or modern, which I had ever seen or exemplified. It was as if the workmanship here were that of another planet. However, I soon saw that my uneasiness had a second and perhaps equally potent source residing in the pictorial and mathematical suggestions of the strange designs. The patterns all hinted of remote secrets and unimaginable abysses in time and space, and monotonously aquatic nature of the reliefs became almost sinister. Among these reliefs were fabulous monsters of abhorrent grotesqueness and malignity, half ichthic and half batrachian in suggestion, which one could not dissociate from certain haunting and uncomfortable senses of pseudo-memory, as if they called upon some image from deep cells and tissues whose retentive functions are wholly primal and awesomely ancestral. At times, I fancied that every contour of these blasphemous fish frogs was overflowing with the ultimate quintessence of unknown and inhuman evil. In odd contrast to the tiara's aspect was its brief and prosy history as related by Miss Tilton. It had been pawned for a ridiculous sum at a shop in State Street in 1873 by a drunken Innsmouth man shortly afterwards killed in a brawl. The society had acquired it directly from the pawnbroker, at once giving it a display worthy of its quality. It was labeled as of probably East Indian or Indo-Chinese provenance, though the attribution was frankly tentative. Miss Tilton, comparing all possible hypotheses regarding its origin and its presence in New England, was inclined to believe that it formed parts of some exotic pirate horde discovered by old Captain Obed Marsh. This view was surely not weakened by the insistent offers of purchase at high price when the Marshes began to make as soon as they knew of its presence, and which they repeated to this day despite the society's unvarying determination not to sell. As the good lady showed me out of the building, she made it clear that the pirate theory of the Marsh fortune was a popular one among the intelligent people of the region. Her own attitude towards shadowed Innsmouth, which she had never seen, was one of disgust at a community slipping far down on the cultural scale, and she assured me that the rumors of devil worship were partly justified by a peculiar secret cult which had gained force there and engulfed all the Orthodox churches. It was called, she said, the Esoteric Order of Dagon, and was undoubtedly a debased quasi-pagan thing imported from the East a century before, at a time when the Innsmouth fisheries seemed to be going barren. Its persistence among a simple people was quite natural in view of the sudden and permanent return of abundantly fine fishing, and it soon came to be the greatest influence in the town, replacing Freemasonry altogether and taking up a headquarters in the old Masonic Hall on New Church Green. All this, to the pious Miss Tilton, formed an excellent reason for shunning the ancient town of decay and desolation, but to me it was merely a fresh incentive. To my architectural and historical anticipations was now added an acute anthropological zeal, and I could scarcely sleep in my small room at the Y as the night wore away. Shortly before 10 the next morning, I stood with one small valise in front of Hammond's drugstore in the Old Market Square, waiting for the Innsmouth bus. As the hour for its arrival drew near, I noticed a general drift of the loungers to other places up the street, or to the ideal lunch across the square. Evidently, the ticket agent had not exaggerated the dislike which local people bore towards Innsmouth and its denizens. In a few moments, a small motor coach of extreme decrepitude and dirty gray color rattled down the street and made a turn, drew up to the curb beside me. I felt immediately that it was the right one, a guess which the half-legible sign on the windshield, Arkham, Innsmouth, Newport, soon verified. There were only 3 passengers, dark, unkempt men of sullen visage and somewhat youthful cast, and when the vehicle stopped, they clumsily shambled out and began walking up State Street in silent, almost furtive fashion. The driver also alighted, and I watched him as he went into the drugstore to make some purchase. This, I reflected, must be the Joe Sargent mentioned by the ticket agent, and even before I noticed any details, there spread over me a wave of spontaneous aversion which could be neither checked nor explained. It suddenly struck me as very natural that the local people should not wish to ride on a bus owned and driven by this man, or to visit any oftener than possible the habitat of such a man and his kinsfolk. When the driver came out of the store, I looked at him more carefully and tried to determine the source of my evil impressions. He was a thin, stoop-shouldered man, not much under 6 feet tall, dressed in shabby blue civilian clothes and wearing a frayed golf cap. His age was perhaps 35, but the odd, deep creases in the sides of his neck made him seem older when one did not study his dull, expressionless face. He had a narrow head, bulging, watery blue eyes that seemed never to wink, a flat nose, a receding forehead and chin, and singularly undeveloped ears. His long, thick lip and coarse-pored grayish cheeks seemed almost beardless except for some sparse yellow hairs that straggled and curled in irregular patches. And in places, the surface seemed queerly irregular, as if peeling from some cutaneous disease. His hands were large and heavily veined and had a very unusual gray-blue tinge. The fingers were strikingly short in proportion to the rest of the structure and seemed to have a tendency to curl closely into the huge palm. As he walked towards the bus, I observed his peculiarly shambling gait and saw that his feet were inordinately immense. The more I studied them, the more I wondered how he could buy any shoes to fit him. A certain greasiness about the fellow increased my dislike. He was evidently given to working or lounging around the fish docks and carried with him much of their characteristic smell. Just what foreign blood was in him I could not even guess. His oddities certainly did not look Asiatic, Polynesian, Levantine, or Negroid, yet I could see why the people found him alien. I myself would have thought of biological degeneration rather than alienage. I was sorry when I saw there would be no other passengers on the bus. Somehow I did not like the idea of riding alone with this driver. But as leaving time was obviously approaching, I conquered my qualms and followed the man aboard, extending him a dollar bill and murmuring the single word Innsmouth. He looked curiously at me for a second as he returned 40 cents change without speaking. Took a seat far behind him, but on the same side of the bus, since I wished to watch the shore during the journey. Man, I wish I could get a bus ride for 60 cents to, like, another town. At length, the decrepit vehicle started with a jerk and rattled noisily past the old brick buildings of State Street amidst a cloud of vapor from the exhaust. Glancing at the people at the sidewalks, I thought I detected in them a curious wish to avoid looking at the bus, or at least a wish to avoid seeming to look at it. Then we turned to the left into High Street, where the going was smoother, flying by stately old mansions of the early Republic and still older colonial farmhouses, passing the Lower Green and Parker River, and finally emerging into a long, monotonous stretch of open shore country. The day was warm and sunny, but the landscape of sand, sedgegrass, and stunted shrubbery became more and more desolate as we proceeded. Out of the window I could see the blue water and the sandy line of Plum Island, and we presently drew very near the beach as our narrow road veered off from the main highway to Rowley and Ipswich. There were no visible houses. I could tell by the state of the road, and the traffic was very light hereabouts. The small, weather-worn telephone poles carried only 2 wires. Now and then we crossed crude wooden bridges over tidal creeks that wound far inland and promoted general isolation of the region. Once in a while, I noticed dead stumps and crumbling foundations above the drifting sand, and recalled the old tradition quoted in one of the histories I have read, that this was once a fertile and thickly settled countryside. The change, it was said, came simultaneously with the Innsmouth epidemic of 1846, and was thought by simple folks to have a dark connection with hidden forces of evil. Actually, it was caused by the unwise cutting of the woodlands near the shore, which robbed the soil of its best protection and opened the way for waves of wind-blown sand. As we lost sight of the Plum Island and saw the vast expanse of the open Atlantic on our left, our narrow course began to climb steeply, and I felt a singular sense of disquiet in looking at the lonely crest ahead, where the rutted roadway met the sky. It was as if the bus were about to keep on its ascent, leaving the sane earth altogether and merging with the unknown arcana of upper air and cryptical sky. The smell of the sea took on ominous implications, and the silent driver's bent, rigid back and narrow head became more and more hateful. As I looked at him, I saw that the back of his head was almost as hairless as his face, having only a few straggled yellow strands upon a gray, scabrous surface. Then we reached the crest and beheld the outspread of the valley beyond, where the Manischet joins just north of the long line of cliffs that culminate in Kingsport Head and veer off towards Cape Ann. On the far misty horizon, I could just make out the dizzy profile of the head, topped by the queer ancient houses of which so many legends are told. But for the moment, all my attention was captured by the nearer panorama just below me. I realized, come face to face with rumor-shadowed Innsmouth. It was a town of wide extent and dense construction, yet one with a portentous dearth of visible life. From the tangle of chimney pots, scarcely a wisp of smoke came, and the 3 tall steeples loomed and stark and unpainted against the seaward horizon. One of them was crumbling down at the top, and in that and another there were only black gaping holes where the clock dials should have been. The vast huddle of sagging gambrel roofs and peaked gables conveyed with offensive clearness the idea of wormy decay, And as we approached along the now descending road, I could see that many roofs had wholly caved in. There were some large and square Georgian houses, too, with hipped roofs, cupolas, and railed widows' walks. These are mostly well back from the water, and one or two seemed to be in moderately sound condition. Stretching inland from among them, I saw the rusted grass-grown line of abandoned railway, with leaning telegraph poles now devoid of wires, and the half-obscure lines of the old carriage roads to Rowley and Ipswich. The decay was worst close to the waterfront, though in its very midst I could spy the white belfry of a fairly well-preserved brick structure which looked like a small factory. The harbor, long and clogged with sand, was enclosed by ancient stone breakwater, on which I could begin to discern the minute forms of a few seated fishermen, and at whose end were what looked like the foundations of a bygone lighthouse. A sandy tongue had formed inside the barrier, and upon it I saw a few decrepit caverns, moored dories, and scattered lobster pots. The only deep water seemed to be where the river poured out past the belfried structure and turned southward to join the ocean at the breakwater's end. Here and there the ruins of wharves jutted out from the shores to end in indeterminate rottenness. Those farthest south seemed to be the most decayed, and far out at sea, despite the high tide, I glimpsed a long black line scarcely rising above the water, yet carrying a suggestion of odd latent malignancy. This, I knew, must be Devil's Reef. As I looked, a subtle curious sense of beckoning seemed superadded to the grim repulsion, and oddly enough, I found this overtone more disturbing than the primary impression. We met no one on the road, but presently began to pass deserted farms in varying stages of ruin. Then I noticed a few inhabited houses with rags stuffed in the broken windows, and shells and dead fish lying about in the littered yards. Once or twice I saw listless-looking people working in barren gardens or digging clams on the fishy-smelling beach below, and groups of dirty simian vice-aged children playing around weed-grown doorsteps. Some of these people seemed more disquieting than the dismal buildings, for almost every one had certain peculiarities of face and motions which I instinctively disliked without being able to define or comprehend them. For a second, I thought this typical physique suggested some picture I had seen, perhaps in a book, under circumstances of particular horror or melancholy, but this pseudo-recollection passed very quickly. As this bus reached a lower level, I began to catch a steady note of waterfall through the unnatural stillness. The leaning, unpainted houses grew thicker, lined both sides of the roads, and displayed more urban tendencies than did those we were leaving behind. The panorama ahead had contracted to a street scene, and in spots I could see where cobblestone pavement and stretches of brick sidewalks had formerly existed. All the houses were apparently deserted, and there were occasional gaps where tumble-down chimneys and cellar walls told of buildings that had collapsed. Pervading everything was the most nauseous, fishy odor imaginable. Soon across the streets, the junctions began to appear, those on the left leading to shoreward realms of unpaved squalor and decays, while those on the right showed vistas of departed grandeur. So far I had seen no people in the town, but there now came signs of a sparse habitation, curtained windows here and there, and an occasional battered motor car at the curb. Pavement and sidewalks were increasingly well defined, and though most of the houses were quite old, wooden brick structures of the early 19th century, they were obviously kept fit for habitation. As an amateur antiquarian, I almost lost my olfactory disgust and my feeling of menace and repulsion amidst this rich, unaltered survival from the past. But I was not to reach my destination without one very strong impression of poignantly disagreeable quality. The bus had come to a sort of open concourse or radial point with churches on two sides and the bedraggled remains of a circular green in the center, and I was looking at a large pillared hill on the right-hand junction ahead. The structure's once white paint was now gray and peeling, and the black and gold sign on the pediment was so faded I could only with difficulty make out the words Esoteric Order of Dagon. This, then, was the former Masonic Hall, now given over to a degraded cult. As I strained to decipher this inscription, my notice was distracted by the raucous tones of a cracked bell across the street, and I quickly turned to look out the window on my side of the coach. The sound came from a squat-towered stone church of manifestly later date than most of the homes, built in a clumsy Gothic fashion and having a disproportionately high basement with shuttered windows. Though the hands of its clock were missing on the side I glimpsed, I knew that those hoarse strokes were tolling the hour of 11. Then suddenly all thoughts of time were blotted out by an onrushing image of sharp intensity and unaccountable horror which had seized me before I knew what it really was. The door of the church basement was open, revealing a rectangle of blackness inside. And as I looked, a certain object crossed, or seemed to cross, that dark rectangle, burning into my brain a momentary conception of nightmare, which was all the more maddening because analysis could not show a single nightmarish quality in it. It was a living object, the first except the driver I had seen since entering the compact part of town, and had I been in a steadier mood, I would have found nothing whatever of terror in it. Clearly, as I realized a moment later, it was the pastor, clad in some peculiar vestments doubtless introduced since the Order of Dagon had modified the ritual of the local churches. The thing which had probably caught my first subconscious glance and supplied the touch of bizarre horror was the tall tiara he wore, an almost exact duplicate of the one Miss Tilton had shown me the previous evening. This, acting on my imagination, had supplied nameless sinister qualities to the indeterminate face and roamed shambling form beneath it. There was not, I soon decided, any reason why I should have felt that shuddering touch of evil pseudo-memory. Was it not natural that the local mystery cult should adopt among its regimentals a unique type of headdress made familiar to the community in some way, perhaps as a treasure trove? A very thin sprinkling of repellent-looking youngish people now became visible on the sidewalks, lone individuals and silent knots of 2 or 3. The lower floors of the crumbling houses sometimes harbored small shops or dingy signs, and I noticed parked truck or two as we rattled along. The sound of the waterfalls became more and more distinct, and presently I saw a fairly deep river gorge ahead, spanned by a wide iron-railed highway bridge beyond which a large square opened out. As we clanked over the bridge, I looked on both sides and observed some factory buildings on the edge of the grassy bluff, or part of the way down. The water far below was very abundant, and I could see 2 vigorous sets of falls upstream on my right and at least 1 downstream on my left. From this point, the noise was quite deafening. Then we rolled into the large semicircular square across the river and drew up on the right-hand side in front of a tall, cupola-crowned building with remnants of yellow paint and a half-a-face sign proclaiming it to be the Gilman House. I was glad to get out of that bus, and at once proceeded to check my valise in the shabby hotel lobby. There was only one person in sight, an elderly man without what had come to call the Innsmouth look. And I decided not to ask him of any of the questions which bothered me. I remember the odd things had been noticed in this hotel. Instead, I strolled out into the square, from which the bus had already gone, and studied the scene minutely and appraisingly. One side of the cobblestoned open space was the straight line of the river. The other was a semicircle of slant-roof buildings of about the 1800 period, from which several streets radiated away to the southeast, south, and southwest. Lamps were depressingly few and small, all low-powered incandescents, and I was glad that my plans called for departure before dark, even though I knew the moon would be bright. The buildings were all in fair condition, and included perhaps a dozen shops in current operation, of which one was a grocery of the First National chain, others a dismal restaurant, a drugstore, and a wholesale fish dealer's office. And still another, at the eastward extremity of the square near the river, an office of the town's only industry, the Marsh Refining Company. There were perhaps 10 people visible, and 4 or 5 automobiles and motor trucks stood scattered about. I did not need to be told that this was the civil center of Innsmouth. Eastward I could catch blue glimpses of the harbor, against which rose the decaying remains of 3 once beautiful Georgian steeples. And towards the shore on the opposite bank of the river, I saw the white belfry surmounting what I took to be the Marsh Refinery. For some reason or another, I chose to make my first inquiries at the chain grocery, whose personnel was not likely to be native to Innsmouth. I found a solitary boy of about 17 in charge, and was pleased to note the brightness and affability which promised cheerful information. He seemed exceptionally eager to talk. As soon as I gathered that he did not like the place, its fishy smell, or its furtive people, a word with any outsider was a relief to him. He hailed from Arkham, boarded with a family who came from Ipswich, and went back whenever he got a moment off. His family did not like him to work in Innsmouth, but the chain had transferred him there, and he did not wish to give up his job. There was, he said, no public library or chamber of commerce in Innsmouth, but I could probably find my way about. The street I had come down was Federal. West of that were the old residence streets, Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and Adams, and east of it were the shoreward slums. It was in these slums, along Main Street, that I would find the old Georgian churches, but they were all long abandoned. It would not be well to make oneself too conspicuous in such neighborhoods, especially north of the river, since the people were sullen and hostile. Some strangers had even disappeared. Certain spots were almost forbidden territory, as he learned at considerable cost. One must not, for example, linger much around the Marsh Refinery, or around any of the still-used churches, or around the pillared Order of the Dagon Hall at New Church Green. Those churches were very odd, all violently disavowed by their respective denominations elsewhere, and apparently using the queerest kind of ceremonials and clerical vestments. Their creeds were heterodox and mysterious, involving hints of certain marvelous transformations leading to bodily immortality, of a sort, on this earth. The youth's own pastor, Dr. Wallace of Ashbury M.E. Church in Arkham, had gravely urged him not to join any church in Innsmouth. As for the Innsmouth people, the youth hardly knew what to make of them. They were as furtive and seldom seen as animals that live in burrows, and one could hardly imagine how they passed time apart from their desultory fishing. Perhaps, judging from the quantities of bootleg liquor they consumed, they lay for most of the daylight hours in an alcoholic stupor. They seemed sullenly banded together in some sort of fellowship and understanding, despising the world as if they had access to other and preferable spheres of entity. Their appearance, especially those staring, unwinking eyes which one never saw shut, was certainly shocking enough, and their voices were disgusting. It was awful to hear them chanting in their churches at night, and especially during their main festivals or revivals, which fell twice a year on April 30th and October 31st. They were very fond of the water and swam a great deal in both river and harbor. Swimming races out to Devil Reef were very common, and everyone in sight seemed well able to share in this arduous sport. When one came to think of it, it was generally only rather young people who were seen about in the public, and of these oldest were apt to be the most tainted-looking. When exceptions did occur, they were mostly persons with no trace of aberrancy, like the old clerk at the hotel. One wondered what became of the bulk of the older folk, and whether the Innsmouth look were not a strange and insidious disease phenomena which increased its hold as the years advanced. Only a very rare affliction, of course, could bring about such a vast and radical anatomical changes in a single individual after maturity, changes involving osseous factors as basic as the shape of the skull, but then even this aspect was no more baffling and unheard of than the visible features of the malady as a whole. It would be hard, the youth implied, to form any real conclusions regarding such a matter, since one never came to know the natives personally, no matter how long one might live in Innsmouth. The youth was certain that many specimens, even worse than the worst visible ones, were kept locked indoors in some places. People sometimes heard the queerest kinds of sounds. The tottering waterfront hovels north of the river were reputedly connected by hidden tunnels, being thus a veritable warren of unseen abnormalities. What kind of foreign blood, if any, these beings had was impossible to tell. They sometimes kept certain especially repulsive characters out of sight when the government agents and others from the outside world came to town. It would be of no use, my informant said, to ask the natives anything about the place. The only one who would talk was a very aged but normal-looking man who lived at the poorhouse on the north rim of the town and spent his time walking about or lounging around the fire station. This hoary character, Zadok Allen, was 96 years old and somewhat touched in the head, besides being the town drunkard. He was a strange, furtive creature who constantly looked over his shoulder as if afraid of something, and when sober, could not be persuaded to talk at all with strangers. He was, however, unable to resist any offer of his favorite poison, and once drunk would furnish the most astonishing fragments of whispered reminiscence. After all, though, this little useful data could be gained from him, since his stories were all insane, incomplete hints of impossible marvels and horrors which could have no source save his own disordered fancy. Nobody ever believed him, but the natives did not like him to drink and talk with strangers, and it was not always safe to be seen questioning him. It was probably from him that some of the wildest popular whispers and delusions were derived. Several non-native residents have reported monstrous glimpses from time to time, but between old Zadok tales and the malformed inhabitants, it was no such wonder such illusions were current. None of the non-natives ever stayed out late at night, there being a widespread impression that it was not wise to do so. Besides, the streets were loathsomely dark. As for business, the abundance of fish was certainly almost uncanny, but the natives were taking less and less advantage of it. Moreover, prices were falling and competition was growing. Of course, the town's real business was the refinery, whose commercial office was on the square only a few doors east of where we stood. Old Man Marsh was never seen, but sometimes went to the works in a closed, curtained car. There were all sorts of rumors about how Marsh had come to the look. He had once been a great dandy, and people said he wore the frock-coated finery of the Edwardian age curiously, adapted to certain deformities. His sons had formerly conducted the office at the square, but latterly they had been keeping out of sight a good deal and leaving the brunt of the affairs to the younger generation. The sons and their sisters had come to look very queer, especially the elder ones, and it was said that their health was failing. One of the Marsh daughters was a repellent, reptilian-looking woman who wore an excess of weird jewelry clearly of the same exotic tradition as to which the strange tiara belonged. My informant had noticed it many times and had heard it spoken as coming from some secret horde, either pirates or demons. The clergymen or priests, or whatever they're called nowadays, also wore this kind of ornament as a headdress, but one seldom caught glimpses of them. Other specimens the youth had not seen, though many were rumored to exist around Innsmouth. The Marshes, together with the other three gently bred families of the town, the Waits, the Gilmans, and the Elliots, were all very retiring. They lived in immense houses along the Washington Street, and several were reputed to harbor in concealment certain living kinsfolk whose personal aspect forbade public view, and whose deaths had been reported and recorded. Warning me that many of the street signs were down, the youth drew for my benefit a rough but ample and painstaking sketch map of the town's salient features. After a moment's study, I felt sure it would be of great help, and pocketed it with profuse thanks. Disliking the dinginess of the single restaurant I had seen, I bought a fair supply of cheese and crackers and ginger wafers to serve as lunch later on. My program, I decided, would be to thread the principal streets, talk with any non-natives I might encounter, and catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham. The town, I could see, formed a significant and exaggerated example of communal decay, but being no sociologist, I would limit my serious observations to the field of architecture. Thus, I began my systematic, though half-bewildered tour of Innsmouth's narrow, shadow-blighted ways. Crossing the bridge and turning towards the roar of the lower falls, I passed close to the Marsh refinery, which seemed oddly free from the noise of industry. This building stood on the steep river bluff near a bridge in an open confluence of streets, which I took to be the earliest civic center, displaced after the Revolution by the present town square. Recrossing the gorge on the main street, I struck a region of utter desertion which somehow made me shudder. Collapsing huddles of gambrel roofs formed a jagged and fantastic skyline, above which rose the ghoulish, decapitated steeple of an ancient church. Some houses along Main Street were tenanted, but most were tightly boarded up. Down unpaved side streets, I saw the black, gaping windows of deserted hovels, many of which leaned at perilous and incredible angles through the sinking part of the foundation. Those windows stared so spectrally that it took courage to turn eastward towards the waterfront. Certainly the terror of a deserted house swells in geometrical rather than arithmetical progression as the houses multiply to form the city of stark desolation. The sight of such endless avenues of fishy-eyed vacancy and death, and the thought of such linked infinities of black, brooding compartments given over to cobwebs and memories of the conqueror worm, started up vestigial fears and aversions that not even the stoutest philosophy can disperse. Fish Street was as deserted as the main, though it differed in having many brick and stone warehouses still in excellent shape. Water Street was almost its duplicate, save that there were great seaward gaps where wharves had been. Not a living thing did I see, except for the scattered fishermen on the distant breaker, and not a sound did I hear save the lapping of the harbor tides and the roar of the falls of the Manishet. The town was getting more and more on my nerves, and I looked behind me furtively as I picked my way back over the tottering Water Street Bridge. The Fish Street Bridge, according to the sketch, was in ruins. North of the river, there were traces of squalid life, active fish-packing houses in Water Street, smoking chimneys and patched roofs here and there, occasional sounds from indeterminate sources, and infrequent shambling forms in the dismal streets and unpaved lanes. But I seemed to find this even more oppressive than the southerly desertion. For one thing, the people were more hideous and abnormal than those near the center of the town, so that I was several times evilly reminded of something utterly fantastic which I could not quite place. Undoubtedly, the alien strain in the Innsmouth folk was stronger here than farther inland, unless indeed the Innsmouth look were a disease rather than a blood strain, in which case this district might be held harbor to some more advanced cases. One detail that annoyed me was the distribution of the few faint sounds I heard. They ought naturally to have come wholly from the visibly inhabited houses, yet in reality were often strongest inside the most rigidly boarded up facades. There were creakings, scurryings, and hoarse, doubtful noises, and I thought uncomfortably about the hidden tunnels suggested by the grocery boy. Suddenly, I found myself wondering what the voices of those denizens would be like. I had heard no speech so far in this corridor, and was unaccountably anxious not to do so. Pausing only long enough to look at two fine but ruinous old churches at Main and Church Streets, I hastened out that vile waterfront slum. My next logical goal was the new church green, but somehow or other I could not bear to repass the church whose basement I had glimpsed the inexplicably frightening form of that strangely diademed priest or pastor. Besides, the grocery youth had told me that churches, as well as the Order of Dagon Hall, were not advisable neighborhoods for strangers. Accordingly, I kept north along Main to Martin, and then turning inland, crossed Federal Street safely north of the Green, and entered the decay patrician neighborhood of northern Broad, Washington, Lafayette, and Adams Streets. Though these stately old avenues were ill-surfaced and unkempt, their elm-shaded dignity had not entirely departed. Mansion after mansion claimed my gaze, most of them decrepit and boarded up amidst neglected grounds, but one or two in each street showing signs of occupancy. In Washington Street, there was a row of 4 or 5 in excellent repair, and with finely tended lawns and gardens. The most sumptuous of these, with wide terraced parterres extending back the whole way to Lafayette Street, I took to be home of the old man Marsh, the afflicted refinery owner. In all these streets, no living thing was visible, and I wondered at the complete absence of cats and dogs from Innsmouth. Another thing which puzzled and disturbed me, even in some of the best-preserved mansions, was the tightly shuttered condition of many third-story and attic windows. Furtiveness and secretiveness seemed universal in this hushed city of alienage and death, and I could not escape the sensation of being watched from ambush on every hand by sly, staring eyes that never shut. I shivered as the cracked stroke of 3 sounded from the belfry on my left. Too well did I recall the squat church and from which the notes came. Following Washington Street towards the river, I now faced a new zone of former industry and commerce. Noting the ruins of a factory ahead, and seeing others with the traces of an old railway station and covered railway bridge beyond, up the gorge on my right. The uncertain bridge now before me was posted with a warning sign, but I took the risk and crossed again to the south bank, where traces of life reappeared. Furtive, shambling creatures stared cryptically in my direction, and more normal faces eyed me coldly and curiously. Innsmouth was rapidly becoming intolerable, and I turned down Payne Street towards the square in the hopes of getting some vehicle to take me to Arkham before the still distant starting time of that sinister bus. It was then that I saw the tumble-down fire station on my left and noticed the red-faced, bushy-bearded, watery-eyed old man in nondescript rags who sat on a bench in front of it, talking with a pair of unkempt but not abnormal-looking firemen. This, of course, must be Zadok Allen, the half-crazed, licorice nonagerian, whose tales of old Innsmouth and its shadows were so hideous and incredible. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from the dark hidden source, which made me change my plans as I did. I long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even hurrying towards the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay, but the sight of old Zadok Allen set upon new currents on my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the native made it unsafe to be talking with him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense of caution, and in my youthful egotism I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring which I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the firemen would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth had said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off of Square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his ways. Perhaps being used to the custom of such conventional strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for, shuffling out of Payne Street and around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street, on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. That seems highly safe. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw the grass-grown opening towards the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of the earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long secret colloquy, so I guided my companion down the lane and picked out a spot to sit among in the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation, if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations, I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Towards the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my question had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was towards the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, and then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waters. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent towards me, took a hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints, I could not be mistaken. Let's see. Oh man, this guy is gonna talk for like 5 pages. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off. Oh wait, that's where it all began. That cursed place of wickedness where the deep water starts. Gates of hell, sheer drop down the bottom, no sound in line can touch. Old Captain Obed done him. That found out more than was good for him on the South Seas inlands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business. Even the new ones. And the best of the men folks killed to privateering in the War 1812 are lost with the Elizzy brig and the Ranger scow. Both of them Gilman vendors. Obed Marsh, he had 3 ships afloat. Brigandine Columby, Brig Hetty, and Bark Sumatry Queen. He was the only one that kept on with the East Indian Pacific trade, though Esdras Martin's barkentine Malay Bride made a venture as late as the 28. Nobody was like old Captain Obed, old limb of Satan. I can mind him a-telling about foreign parts and talking about the folks stupid for going to Christian meetings and bearing their burdens meek and lowly. Says he could get better gods than some of the folks in the Ingies. Gods as would bring them good fishing in return for their sacrifices and would really answer folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only it was Asian folks doing any heathen things. Told about the island east of Otaheite, where there was a lot of stone ruins older than anybody knew anything about. Kind of like those on Pawnee and the Carolines, but with carvings of faces that looked like big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near, too, where the other ruins of different carvings were all the way like they'd been under the sea once, with pictures of awful monsters on them. Well, sir, Matt says the natives around there had all fish they could catch, and sported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made of queer kind of gold they covered with pictures of monsters, just like the ones carved over the ruins on the little island. Sorta fish-like frogs or frog-like fishes that was drawn in all kinds of positions, like they was human beings. Nobody could get out with them, said got all that stuff, and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish aplenty even when the very next islands had lean pickings. Matt says he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices, besides that lots handsome young folks that drop out of sight for good from year to year, and they weren't many old folks around. Also, he thinks some of the folks look darn queer, even for Kanakis. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathens. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they come from and if they could get more, and finally wormed the story about the old chief. Wallachia, they call him. Nobody Obed could believe the old yeller devil, but the captain could read folks like they was books. Nobody never believes me now when I tell him, and I don't suppose you will, young fellow, even though look at you have kind of got them sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whispers grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere portentousness of his intonations, even though I knew his tale could be nothing more than drunken fantasy. Well, sir, Obed, he learnt that these things on this earth that folks never heard about. They wouldn't believe if they did. It seems these Kanakis was sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of god things that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favor in return. They met these things on a little island with the queer ruins, and it seems them awful pictures of frogfish monsters was supposed to be pictures of these things. Maybe there was the kind of critters that got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities under the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from that. Seems there was some of the things alive in the stone buildings when the island come up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakis got wind that was going down that. Made sign talk soon as they got over being skirt, and pierced up a bargain before long. Them things like human sacrifices. Had 'em ages afore, but lost track in the upper world after a time. What they done to the victims, it ain't for me to say, and I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was right about the heathens, 'cause they'd been having a hard time, desperate about everything. They give a starting number of young folks to the sea thing twice every year, may even Halloween, regular as could be, and give some of the carved knickknacks they made. What things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They druv 'em from all over the sea, and a few gold-like things now and then. Well, as I say, the natives met them things on the volcanic islet, going there in canoes at the sacrifice and set tree,
bringing back any of the gold-like jewels as were coming to them. At first, the things never did go on the main island, but after a time, they come to want us, or they come to want to. Seems they got hankering ardor mixing with the folks and having gent ceremonies on the big days, May Eve and Halloween. You see, they were able to live both in and out of the water. They're what they call amphibians, I guess. The Kanakis told them as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe them out because they've got wind of them being there. But they says they don't care much because they could wipe out a whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, as any didn't have certain signs such as ones lost by the old ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they lay low and when anybody visited the island. When it comes to mating them toad-like and fishies, the Kanakis kind of balked, but finally they learned something to put a face on the matter. Seems that human folks has got kind of relation to such water beasts, and everything alive come about the water only once, and only needs a little change to go back again. Them things told Kanakis that if they mixed bloods, there'd be children that looked human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, till finally they take to the water, and just the main lot of things down that. And this is the important part, young feller, as them as turned into fish things and went in the water wouldn't never die. Them things never die except when they was killed violent. Well, sir, it seems the time for Obed. No, them islanders was getting all full of fish from them deep water things. When they got old and begun to show it, and it was kept hidden until they felt like taking the water and quitting the place. Some more tech than others, and some never did change quite enough to take to the waters, but mostly they turned out just the way things said. Them as was born more like the things changed early, but them was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trial trips for that. Folks as had to look at the water generally come back a good deal to visit. So as a man often be talking about his own 5 times great-grandfather who'd left dry land a couple 100 years afore. Everybody has got about the idea of dying, except in canoe wars on the other islanders or sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snake bite or plague or sharp galloping ailments or something before they could take to the water. But simply look forward to the kind of change that wasn't a bit horrible after a while. They thought they'd got what they all had to give up, and I guess Obed kind of come to the same thing himself when he chewed over old Wakalea's story a bit. Or Wallachea. Wallachea, though, was one of the few he hasn't got none of the fish blood, being of a royal line that intermarried with royal lines of other islands. Wallachea, he showed Obed a lot of rites and incantations he had to do with the sea things, and let him see some of the folks in the village as had changed from a lot from human shape. Somehow or another, he never would let him see one of the regular things from right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajig made out of lead or something, and he said to bring up the fish from any place in the water where they might have a nest of them. The idea was to drop it down with the right kind of prayers and such. Wallachea allowed the things that was scattered all over the world, so any was about to find one could find a nest and bring them up if they wanted. Matt, he didn't like that business at all and wanted Obed should keep away from the island, but the captain was sharp for again and found that he could get them gold-like things so cheap it'd pay him to make specialty of them. Things went down that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery and Waite's old rundown fullin' mill. He didn't dash sell the pieces like they was, for folks would be all the time asking questions. All the same, his crews would get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though they were swore to keep quiet, and he let his women folks wear some of the pieces as he was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38, when I was 7 years old, Obed, he found the island people all wiped out between voyages. Seems the other islanders had got wind of what was going on and took matters into their own hands. So they must have had, after all, the old magic signs of the sea that says that only things he was afeared. No telling what any of them Kanakis will chance to get a hold of when the sea bottom throws up some island with ruins older than the deluge. Pious cusses these was. They didn't leave nothing standing on either the main island or the little volcanic islet except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places, there was little stones strewn about, like charms, with something on them that you call swastika nowadays. Probably was the old one's signs. Folks all wiped out. No trace of old gold-like things. Ain't none of nearby Kanaki's that breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit there'd ever been any people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth, too, because the seafaring days what profited the master of a ship generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around the town took to the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned, but they was in bad shape because the fishing was peating her out and the mills wasn't doing none too well. Then, so the time Obed began a cursing at the folks being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help 'em none. He told them he'd know the folks prayed to gods that give 'em something they really needed, and says a good bunch of men should stand by him. He could maybe get a hold of certain partners and powers and bring us plenty of fish and a bit of gold. Of course, them sarved the old Sumatri queen and seed the island knows what he meant, and none too anxious to get close to see things that they'd heard tell on. But them as didn't know what 'twas all about got all kinds of swayed by what Obed had to say, and began to ask him what he could do to set them on the way of faith and bring 'em results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled, and lapsed into a moody, then apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder, and then turning back to stare fascinatingly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth and elaborated by imagination at the once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any really substantial foundation, but nonetheless the account held hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in reference to strange jewels clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself rather than of this antique toper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket, and beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself. I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and I thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he really was forming words, and I could grasp a fair portion of them. Poor Matt. Matt, he always was egging it, trying to line up the folks on his side and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They run the congressional parson out of town, and the Methodist fella quit. Never did see resolved Babcock the Baptist parson again. Wrath of Javoy. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard as what I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, Golden Gap and the idols of Canaan and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations, Mene, Tekel, a parson. He stopped talking again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes, I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, huh? Then just tell me, young fellow, why'd Captain Obed and 20-odd other folks used to row about to Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear them all over town when the wind was right? Tell me that, huh? And tell me why Obed was always dropping heavy things down into the deep water to other side of the reef where the bottom shoots down like a cliff lower than you kind sound. Tell me what he'd done in that funny-shaped lead thingamajig that Wallachia gave him, hey, boy? And what they all did howl on May Eve and again the next Halloween? And why the new church parsons, fellers that used to be sailors, wear them queer robes and cover themselves with them gold-like things Obed brung, huh? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back. for he began to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, eh? Maybe you like to have been with me in them days, when I'd seed things at night out to sea in the cupola top of my house. Oh, I can tell ye little pitchers have big ears, and I wasn't messing nothing or gossiping about Captain Obed and the folks about to the reef. How about the night I took my pa's ship glass up to the cupola and seed the reef a bristling, thick with shapes that dived off soon after the moon's riz. Obed and the folks was in a dory, but them shapes dived off the far side in the deep water and never come up. How'd you like to be a little shaver along in a cupola, a watching shapes that weren't human shapes? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. Suppose one night you seed something heavy heave off in Obed's dory beyond the reef, and the next day a young feller was missing from home. Hey, did anybody ever see or hide or hair of Hiram Gillum again? Did they? And Nick Pierce, and Llewellyn Waite, and Adoram Southwick, and Henry Garrison? Shapes talking sign language with their hands, as they had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed began to get his feet again. Folks seeing his 3 darters a wearing gold-like things as nobody's ever seen afore on 'em, and smoke start coming out the refinery chimney. Other folks was prospering too. Fish began to swarm a harbor fit to kill, and heaven knows what size cargoes we began to ship to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the old branch railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody ever see 'em again. And just the folks organized the esoteric order of Dagon and bought Masonic Hall off in Calvary Commandery for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason again on selling, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set on heaven things just like they was on the Kanaki Isle. I don't think he aimed at first to do no mixin', nor raising no young'uns to take to the water and turn into fishes when the eternal life. He wanted them gold things as well and to pay heavy, and I guess the others was satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some looking and thinking for itself. Too many folks missing, too much wild preaching at meeting of a Sunday, too much talk about that reef. I guess I done a bit of telling by Selectman Mowry when I see from the cupola. There was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd about to the reef, and I heard shots between the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 others was in jail, and everybody a-wondering just what was afoot and just what charge against them got to be hold. God, if anybody look ahead, a couple of weeks later when nothing had been throwed into the sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion. I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high waters the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again, I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night, I seed them. I was up in the cupola, hordes of 'em, swarms of 'em, all over the reef, and swimming up the harbor into the Mashhead. God, what happened on the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he clubbed out the kitchen winder with his musket to find Selectman Maury and see what he could do. Mounds of dead and the dying, shots and screams, shouting in Old Square and Town Square and New Church Green. Jail throwed open, proclamation, treason. Called it the plague when folks come in and found half our people missing. Nobody left but them, as you jine with Obed and them. Things are else kept quiet. Never heard o' my pa no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything cleaned up in the morning, but there was traces. Obed, he kinder takes charge and says things are gonna be changed. Others'll worship with us at meeting time, and sartin houses he's got to entertain guests. They don't want to mix like they done with the Kanakis, and he for once didn't feel bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says he brung us fish and treasure, and should have he and should have what they hankered after. Nothing was to be different from the outside, only we was to keep shy of strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later they was second and third oaths that some of us took. Them as a special, get special rewards, gold and such. No use balking, for there was millions of 'em down there. They'd rather not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they was gave away and forced to, they could do a lot towards just that. We didn't have them old charms to cut off folks like that South Sea did, and them Kanakis wouldn't never give away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and arborage in the town when they wanted it, they'll let us well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers as might bear their tails outside, that is, without they got prying. All in the band of the faithful, order the Dagon, and the children should never die, but go back to the mother Hydra and father Dagon, and what we all come from, onct. Yeah, Cthulhu Fathung. Benglui Magranov, Cthulhu Relay, Urok, Nagel, Freda. That's way too many consonants, guys, but he's chanting something. Old Zadok was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul! To what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus his hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him, brought that fertile, imaginative brain? He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. God, what I had seen since I was 15 years old! Mene, mere, tekel, upharsen. The folks was a-missin', and them kilt themselves. Them as told in things in Arkham or Ipswich or sich places, they all called crazy, like you're calling me right now. But God, what I seen! They'd kilt me long ago for what I know, only I took the first and second oaths of Dagon offered Obed, so 'twas protected unless in a jury of 'em proved I told things knowing I deliver it. But I would take the third oath. I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd have died rather than take that. It got worse around the Civil War times, when children born since 46 began to grow up. Some of them, that is, I was afeard, never did no prying, arter that awful night. Never seen one of them close to in all my life. That is, never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I had any guts or sense, I'd never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things once so bad that I suppose was because the government draft men and was in the town out of 63. Arter the war was just as bad again. People began to fall off. Mills and shops shut down. Shipping stopped and the harbor choked up. Railroad give up. But they never stopped swimming in and out of the river from that cursed reef of Satan. And more attic winders got boarded up, and more noises was heard in houses as wasn't supposed to have nobody in 'em. Folks outside have their stories about it. Suppose you heard of plenty of 'em, seeing what questions you asked. Stories about things they've seen now and then, and about that queer jewelry as it comes from somewheres that ain't quite all melted up. But nothing ever gets definite. Nobody'll believe nothing. They call them gold-like things pirate loot, and allow the Innsmouth folks has foreign blood or is distempered by something. Besides, them that lives here shoo off as many strangers as they can and encourage the rest not to get very curious, especially around nighttime. Beasts balk at the critters, horses, wuss'n mules, but when they got autos, it was all right. In 46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in the town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to by them, as he'd called it. Had 3 children by her, 2 as disappeared young, but one gal as looked like anybody else and was educated in Europe. Obed finally got her married off by a trick to an Arkham fellow as didn't expect nothing, but nobody outside'll have nothing to do with Innsmouth folks now. Barnabas Marsh that runs the refinery now is Obed's grandson, and his first wife, son of Onesiphorus, his eldest son, but his mother was another one of them that wasn't never seed outdoors. Right now, Barnabas is about chains. can't shut his eyes no more, and is all out of shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take her to the water soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do something to go down for little spells before they go down for good. Ain't been said about in public for a night in 10 years. Don't know how his poor wife can feel. She come from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he courted her 50-odd years ago. Obed died in 78, and all the rest generation is gone now, and the first wife's children dead, and the rest, God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood from maudlin tearfulness to watchful fear. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder towards the reef, despite the wild absurdness of his tale. I could not help but beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with a louder speech. Hey, you! Why don't you say something? How'd you like to be living in a town like this, and with everything a rotting and a dying and a boarded up monsters crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around black cellars and attics at every way you turn? Hey, how'd you like to hear the howling night after night from the churches of the Order of Dagon Hall and know what's this doing part of the howling? How'd you like to hear what comes from that awful reef every May Eve and Hallowmas? Hey? Think the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell you, that ain't the worst. Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I care to own. Curse ye! You don't sit that staring at me with them eyes. I tell Obed Marsh he's in hell, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I says, can't get me. I ain't done nothing, nor told nobody ain't nothing. Oh, you young fella? Well, even if I ain't told nobody nothing yet, I'm a-going to now. You just sit still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody. Says I didn't get to do no prying arter that night, but I found things out just the same. You want to know what the real horror is, eh? Well, it's this, and it ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they're a-going to do. They're a-bringing things out the war they come from into town. Been doing it for years and slackering up lately. Them houses north of the river betwixt Water and Main Streets is full of them devils and what they brung. And when it get ready, I say when they get ready. Ever heard of a shoggoth? Or heard tell of a shoggoth? Hey, do you hear? I tell ye, I know what them things be. I seen them one night when they... The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek almost made me faint. His eyes, looking past me towards the malodorous sea, were positively starting from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he had glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see, only the incoming tide, with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that near-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper. Get out of here! Get out of here! They seen us! Get out of here for your life! Don't wait for nothing! They know now! Run for it! Quick! Out of this town! Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf, and changed the mad ancient's whispered into another inhuman and blood-curdling scream. Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder and dashed wildly inland towards the street, reeling northwards around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there, and when I reached Water Street and looked along it towards the north, there was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen. Okay. That's good for the first half of The Shadow over Innsmouth. We'll finish that up tomorrow. So far, there's a lot going on. And there's a lot of references to, like, previous stories, like when they keep talking about Cthulhu and also the Shoggoths from the previous story. So, which I'm going to assume that they're considered the same giant, bubbly, 15-foot creatures, but I could be wrong. It might be something else. But yeah, thank you once again, everybody, for being here for this reading. We will be back tomorrow to finish the Shadow over Innsmouth.